Hi Stonewall. Last video I talked about prequels, midquels, and sequels. Today I'm going to talk about backstories and noodle incidences, because I brought that up in the prequel topic of the video. I'm Alex Evie. Welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel. I'm glad to have you, and let's dive on in. So the idea of a backstory is specifically to give us extra context onto a character. Either it could be an entire arc, a little bit of a flashback, or an entire thing on itself in the form of a prequel. But it doesn't always have to be. The idea of a flashback backstory or a type of little bit of animated back pacing is to give us more context on the character it's about. For example, Solo the Star Wars story was trying to give us more context on Han Solo as a character. But it messed up on several regards and is kind of forgettable. To be fair, that's something that a lot of the times a story that's strictly just a backstory of a character can happen. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. An idea of a backstory to a character is kind of giving them more in depth of why they are like this. It's not necessarily a new thing, but it is more common nowadays in the age of storytelling. Because every single character has to be deep, at least from how a perspective of the audience, even though it doesn't have to be. A character can be a shallow puddle and everyone will still love them, but that's what producers think people want, a character that's very deep. Even though you can take anyone in any fandom, can take someone who has less than 5 minutes of screen time and turn them into a fan favorite. The internet is a wacky place and I love it and hate it. But the thing about a backstory is that it can sometimes miss the mark of a character. If we have a flashback to a character and give them an entire story with their backstory, like an entire prequel dedicated to it, the problem that you will face is an arc that hasn't happened yet, but the audience knows how it's going in the conclusion. This is a similar problem that prequels have. In and of the fact of we know how this is most likely going to end. And in backstories, more than ever, we have the rule of character existence. Character existence is something I brought up in the time skip video. This is not a show. This is just me going on weird rants in front of a camera and then posting it on YouTube. I find it fun, and I hope you guys are enjoying it too. But I mentioned in that video that there are 3 things that could happen to a character who's not present in the modern day in a backstory or prequel. Number 1, a character is dead. This is very common in prequels and is the most common overall of the 3 options. Mainly due to the fact that it's the easiest one. If a character's not alive in the modern day or isn't present in the modern day, it's very easy to assume that character is dead. Because that way, the author can quickly clean up their arc without us having to get too attached. If we believe right away that this character is dead, then we don't need to worry about character attachment happening. It's not like the main story, where you will leave a character off with nothing. The character arc is done by the time of the modern day, therefore there's some attachment thing that you can do with it. The opposite option, they're no longer relevant to the main story, that is. They can be very heavily relevant to the plot of the Black story or prequel, but it doesn't always have to be. They can just be a character who is important then and is no longer important now. Like a mentor character to a younger protagonist who is now since retired and no longer is relevant to the story. I mean, they get off better than most mentors that protagonists, as that is one of the most, that's the biggest job in storytelling that has a very high mortality rate. Just saying. But when it comes down to it, a character who is in the backstory and is no longer relevant in the main plot is the safest out of any character in a backstory. If they're no longer relevant in the main plot, they don't need to be worried about that much. They're safe. They are in a safe zone where they don't need to step out of it. They're safer than most characters, especially side characters. And then there's C. I did not touch on C in the video about time skips. I brought it up and just called it Other. Because Other is the rarest and has a lot of stuff that can happen in it. For example, it's a spoiler. If a character is in a backstory and is not there in the present day, but feels too relevant or too important to just have become irrelevant. It's not like a mentor who most likely already had an arc of their own in some past story that we might or might not see. It's not a character that could have died and is now driving force. They're just gone. They're going to be relevant later. It's kind of like a Chekhov's gun type character given in a backstory. In fact, you can actually do this with us already meeting the character in present day. Think about it this way. Say, during an arc, we meet A and we meet C and D, who had some sort of connection to B. Before, C and D weren't really there, but we meet them and have some idea of what their deal is. They know B, but we really don't know how they know B. And they are important partially to the main plot. Later on, we could get a bit more of B's backstory and learn how they met C and D. But that doesn't necessarily need to happen. If we learn about that backstory before we meet C and D, it can be the exact same effect, but a little bit more of a callback to the character's backstory. Further on, in the other section, could also be a situation of a character has changed so much that they are still in the plot, but we just don't recognize it yet. For example, an amnesia plot or a mysterious character who has not revealed their mask yet, or all of that stuff. The C section of the options to do with a character that is not there in the modern day is most of the time in section of a reveal to happen later, or has already happened, you just have not realized it yet. In fact, C can actually be something that's not just a character, it could be an item even. Like a theoretical music box that's actually a key or something. It's important to the character's backstory, their past, but it could also be important for the future. It's also very easy to pull characters that are in the A and B category into the C category if you want a little bit of setup. But it doesn't necessarily even happen. Like, you can have a character fake their own death and then show up later. Honestly, kind of valid, fair. But C often gives the most options. I just find B the funniest because, ha ha ha, you've survived the backstory and now you are completely fine. Yay! There's no better place to be in the story than in a backstory where you are guaranteed survival. But something that a backstory or prequel or any origin story can do is trying to explain the noodle incidences and not understand the point. I'm shifting the video to noodle incidences, and if you don't know what a noodle incidence is, this is heavy. A noodle incidence comes from the comic strip series Calvin and Hobbes, where it's implied that Calvin is on the naughty list because of an incident with noodles. That it. This incident gets brought up but never explained, which is the point of a noodle incident. A noodle incident is a writer's way of expanding the world and the characters. A way of telling the audience that the characters are always doing stuff even when they're not watching. Which is a good thing to do. You don't want the audience to be hyper aware that this is a story that will ruin their immersion. Yeah, they know it's a story, but they don't need proof that a character does absolutely nothing when they're not there. Sane people know that this is fiction, that this is not real, that the characters that they're watching aren't real. Even in documentaries or a overview of something that's already happened, they know that this is kind of overly dramatized or changed to fit the narrative that the story wants to tell. They know for a fact that this isn't exactly what happened. You don't need to be sharing this overly much by not giving the characters nothing else to do when the plot's not happening. That's why it's important to ask yourself questions about your characters to build up what they would probably be doing in their spare time. Growing the characters outside of the norm that you would probably need in a story just so you have a better understanding and can set it up. That's where the tool of the noodle incident comes from. The idea of a noodle incident is an incident where all you probably get is snippets of what happened or or the title of it. It's kind of like that joke in Avengers where Hawkeye and Black Widow are fighting the aliens, and Hawkeye says, "You and I remember Budapest very differently." It's that. That's a noodle incident. It's used consistently throughout storytelling, and you don't need it to be pointed out because you probably know about it. You don't need to know about it. That's the point. It's basically a character's inside joke. Heck, not all characters even need to know about it. In fact, it could be pretty interesting to see other characters react to the story that they weren't a part of, or the story that we didn't get to see. For example, if a character is very defensive about what happened in the noodle incident, they are probably the butt of the joke. If a character wants to keep telling a story about it, and one character says, "Can you stop telling that story?" or "Not that story again." This has been a story that's been told over and over again, and one of them is done hearing about it. Or the other one is just laughing about it as soon as it comes up. They were probably the one doing the joke. Or you can even make something sound very fun or incident, like a unicorn party, in a very dark mood. Like, you can have a character say, "At least it's not the unicorn party." That would give the audience something to speculate about. I answered last time that you don't need to give characters all the answers. You don't need to give the audience all the answers. Let people speculate. The audience loves speculation. You don't need to leave everything open-ended. In fact, those are just called plot holes. But you can leave some holes for ventilation, for the audience to start pondering about more about this world that an author or creator has built. Let them do it. We love doing it. I love doing it. But that's the point of a noodle incident. For characters, along with the audience, to have more that's not just on screen or on the page. So if a backstory tries to answer every single noodle incident, you've missed the point. This is what Solo, a Star Wars story, does. Trying to answer a lot of Han's noodle incidences. Han Solo, as a character in the original prequels, is basically built to have a lot of these. A lot of noodle incidences, and we should probably not hear all of them, because they're definitely not safe for all audiences. But if you try to answer every noodle incident, you leave the audience with nothing to speculate about, and the world feeling a lot less lived in, because we've seen all of their adventures. A show that does a good job with bringing up noodle incidences is Leverage. Every single episode, we get some sort of incident of a character just being, referencing something we didn't see on screen. Like, they could be doing a mid-heist, and we just get a reference to one of them stealing the Stanley Cup, or one of them getting waterboarded. But Leverage is a show packed full of us seeing these characters do heists and do adventures, so we never, ever feel like we're missing out on a story. A noodle incident, a correctly written noodle incident, should never feel like we are missing out on a very fun story, or we are just going to get it later on, so there's no point in speculating on it. In fact, we don't know what the noodle incident is because the writer of Calvin and Hobbes legitimately said he stopped trying to figure out what it was himself because nothing he could think of would match what the audience's expectation of it were.
I have some interjection to this, but I'm going to be talking about a game series that you probably shouldn't be talking about on this show. So I'm expecting to cut this part out. If you're talking about what I think you're talking about, something funny that comes to mind is, postal dude's pigeon hunting adventure, which is done completely off screen under the joke that we didn't have the budget for a pigeon mission.
That's actually basically what I'm talking about. It gives reference to something that the audience or readers or whatever you want to call the people in the fandom have not seen. It gives them something to speculate about. We have no clue what the noodle incident is in Calvin and Hobbes, but we do know it involved noodles.
There's a rocket launcher. Go hunt those pigeons.
I'm not cutting out this part.
Your loss. Wow, that was the greatest thing I've ever done.
Back to trying to implement a noodle incident into a story to expand it. Similar to a backstory, it gives us some more stuff with the characters. Yes, sometimes a backstory can, in fact, have us explain a noodle incident, like how two characters met, or what's the character's past with each other, or why does the character have that one scar on the side of their face. But it doesn't always. Sometimes what the fandom comes up with is way beyond what the author can. A noodle incident is not necessary for a plot or a character arc, because it's supposed to give the audience something that they won't see on screen yet. Yes, sometimes a noodle incident being answered could be interesting, but it doesn't need to. If it's one where it shows how characters met, yeah, that would be great later down the road when we see how their dynamic is. Then we can point out about, hey, that's how their dynamic got established. It's a point of connecting the dots that you don't always need to connect it. It's not like you have to explain it. It's not everything in the story needs explanation. Yes, the important plot beats, like how a character's going to beat the BBEG, is important, but you don't need to explain a noodle incident. I'm putting this down because it is heavy and I'm going to need to put it away anyways. The biggest problem when sharing a character's backstory is sometimes a character's backstory doesn't make sense with the character. Something that's been happening a lot is trying to make villains sympathetic from old media and giving them a backstory and explaining their actions through tragedy. Yes, sympathetic villains can be amazing when done right, but when they're the only villain, and the only thing that we can always think about is the fact that they are sympathetic, your story doesn't really have a villain. I miss the days of pure, unbridled, evil villains. Villains where you don't even need to think about why they're doing this, because they're just dang evil. Yes, we still have them today, but for some reason, writers stray away from having a pure evil villain and a sympathetic one in the exact same story. You can have that. Puss in Boots: The Last Wish had technically 3 villains, one of which was a group of villains, one of which was pure evil, and the other was a literal unbridled force of nature. And it worked perfectly. You never felt like there were too many villains or not enough of them. It's a situation where not all characters can be or should be redeemed. If you try to redeem every single character, then it just shows that every single person's evil actions don't matter. People need some sort of catharsis if a villain has done evil things. Not necessarily a hero taking revenge on a villain, but a hero coming to the realization of they weren't literally looking for revenge. That's the situation that backstories kind of happen when you give a villain a backstory. Sometimes the backstory of a villain is just like, they just want to be evil. Not every single villain needs something that made them this way. Some of them are just like it. But that's why backstories aren't necessarily always needed. Why are they needed? Expand on a character. If a character is always posing more questions than it's answering, giving us, the audience, a backstory or a flashback of it can be very helpful. But you don't need to always go very in-depth with it. Sometimes a character is that simple. One Piece, since it's been a minute since I've talked about it, every single character, we know the gist of them not long after meeting them. For most of the Straw Hats, we have about somewhere between 2 to 5 episodes of just their backstory, except for one, Zorro. It's 2 episodes, and they're not even back to back. This is weird for the reason being, he has the most normal backstory out of any of them, and his takes the least amount of time between it. Not all of the Straw Hats have their backstories back to back. Like, Sanji technically has 2. One when we first meet him in the East Blue, and later on, way down the line. Not going to spoil either of them. But Zoro's backstory mainly consists of why he's so dedicated to becoming the world's greatest swordsman, and how he met his 2 swordsman friends that we saw once in the East Blue. That's it. It also explains where Zoro got his sword, his main sword, because, yeah, he uses 3. But we get to learn a lot about his backstory and how he is in one episode. Something that the live action did, which I am so glad for, is that it cut down Zoro's backstory from one entire episode to about less than a half of it. I think less than 1/3, really. Because his is the simplest. His is the only one that didn't need multiple episodes in the original, and even then, a lot of it could be cut out because a lot of it was just restating stuff. He has the most normal backstory out of any of the Straw Hats, and it's a good thing because holy duck, oh, yeah, that's kind of sad. But yeah, a character's backstory doesn't need to be this deep, in-depth thing. Sometimes just knowing why they're so determined of their motivation, or how they connect back to this specific group or people, can help us understand the character more. Yeah, if we didn't have the character's backstory, it won't affect how we feel about the characters that much, but it would kind of change some of the connotations of what they do. So, when it comes down to a character's backstory, some key points are remembering the character that you are writing about. Does this backstory actually make sense with who they are in the modern day? Number 2, are you trying to explain every single thing that leaves a question about this character? Because if you are, you're missing the mark, and if you aren't trying to answer any of them, you're still missing the mark. You should try to answer some of the more important questions, but also try to leave some stuff to interpretation and speculation. Give your audience something to think about it. 3, it won't be changing the character's arc or affecting the character's arc in any way if this backstory is there. Not necessarily does it need to change the arc, but it could build it up a bit. Give us some reason of why this character is selfish and they need to overcome their selfishness, or why this character is so driven to do things on their own, or all of the above. Give us a little bit more of that. Also, remember which character are you still trying to figure out their backstory. If you don't know a character's backstory while writing them, that's fine. You could have come up with something while still making the story. But make sure that the dots still match. Well, that's the end of today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any more questions, leave them down in the comments. If you have any ideas for more videos, also leave those down in the comments. Like, share, subscribe, do all of that stuff. And I'll see you next time. Give me more stuff that you want to hear. And today, what's a character whose backstory really was not necessary, but you still enjoy it? Along with, what do you want to hear more of? Again, I love your suggestions. Well, until then, I'm going to go off and fight the moon. See y'all later.